Hello and welcome everyone. We are so glad that you are with us, whether it's morning, afternoon, or late in the evening, as I know it is for some of our panelists. We're so glad that you're here. I'm Rebecca Blatchley, Director of the Episcopal Church's Office of Government Relations. And on behalf of the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Working Group on Migration, we are so pleased to welcome you here to this webinar on Anglican responses and perspectives on climate-induced migration. I will turn it over to our moderator, who will introduce the panelists and lead our discussion, the Reverend Canon Dr. Chuck Robertson. Chuck, thank you for leading us in this important discussion today.
Thank you, Rebecca. Again, I am the Reverend Canon Chuck Robertson. I am Canon to the Presiding Bishop for Ministry Beyond the Episcopal Church. And as such, it is my privilege today to welcome three distinguished panelists who will help us think through these issues that we are facing in terms of climate-induced migration. In so many ways in this past year, as we have been focused as a global community on the pandemic, we have often forgotten some of the ongoing concerns that we have as a global community. Our hope is that this conversation today will help us to continue many more conversations and, more important, to find and do actions that can make a difference in terms of climate-induced migration. With us today is Dr. Kanta Kumari Rigaud, who is a lead environmental specialist and regional climate change coordinator for the Africa region of the World Bank Group. She's a leading expert on climate adaptation and resilience and works on climate policy, strategy, and knowledge management. She led the development of the World Bank's Next Generation Africa Climate Business Plan and has been involved in pioneering reports such as Groundswell, Preparing for Internal Climate Migration, and most recently, the Resilience Booster Tool. Dr. Rigaud holds her doctorate from the University of East Anglia in the United Kingdom and is co-chair of the Environmental Change and Migration Working Group of the Global Knowledge Partnership on Migration and Development, NOMAD. It is wonderful to have you with us today, Dr. Rigaud. With us also is the Reverend Canon Dr. Rachel Mash of the Anglican Church of Southern Africa. There she serves as the environmental coordinator for that church, which includes peoples in South Africa, Eswatini, Lesotho, Namibia, Angola, and Mozambique, as well as the provincial coordinator for Green Anglicans, a movement that strives to safeguard the integrity of creation and is now active in 12 countries across Southern, Central, and East Africa. Canon Mash is secretary of the Anglican Communion Environmental Network and also a member of the Ecumenical Season of Creation Steering Committee. She was awarded, indeed, a Lambeth Award of St. Augustine for promoting the 5th mark of mission for the Anglican Communion. Dr. Mash, it is wonderful to have you with us. We are honored and delighted. Dr. Abraham Hauriasi is General Secretary of the Anglican Church of Melanesia and has been so for the last 9 years, in that role serving as the overall administrative head for the 9 dioceses in the Solomon Islands, New Caledonia, Vanuatu, and coordinates works between different church departments, managing budgets and finances, and facilitating relationships with the church's partner organizations. Dr. Hauriasi earned a doctorate in accounting, specifically studying the sociological aspects of this discipline. He spent 1 year as an accounting lecturer at the University of the South Pacific. Dr. Hauriasi, it is wonderful to have you with us. And while we are here on morning time in the Eastern time zone of the States, I can see it is not quite morning where you are. Thank you indeed for being with us. It is wonderful to have all three of you with us. And Dr. Rigaud, as you have to leave us to go to some important work very soon, I want to start with you and just be able to start with asking you to talk a little bit about the academic scholarship on climate change and migration. What are we seeing now? What will impact climate migration in the future?
Thank you very much, Reverend Chuck. It's my pleasure to be here and to answer the question. I will perhaps talk through my presentation with your kind permission.
Thank you. And as you do that and put it on the slideshow, yes, I would also remind our viewers to please have any questions that come up in your mind as you see this and the other presentations, to put them in the Q&A. And in the chat room, simply tell us who you are. Dr. Rigaud, all yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you once again, and for the pleasure of joining all of you on what I think, as Dr. Chuck noted, a really important conversation. I will spend the next several minutes just talking through the issue on the potency of climate migration and how we can avert the crisis. We know that this is a phenomenon that is already unfolding before us, but I think it's equally important to understand how, in the face of increasing and intensifying climate change, this could actually be rolling out. So I'll talk a little bit about what motivated us to do this work at the World Bank, the approach that we use to understand the future of climate migration, some key results and areas of action. And it's really good to see how the Anglican Church is being active on this front. So first of all, I think to the point that was made, I mean, this issue of displacement and migration has been something that has been unfolding, and we've heard lots of stories in the media about this phenomenon. Back about 10 years now, we had this massive floods in Pakistan that really affected 20 million people, a sizable part of the population, and displaced 1 million. But even from Pakistan, we're beginning to see, even in Europe, where we are seeing increased displacements as a consequence of heat waves and floods, and there has been information and data collected on this front. So I think the most useful piece of information is the recent report, a report that is put out every year by the International Displacement Monitoring Center. And they put out a report to understand what have been the total number of additional displacements each year and what is the stock of displacements. So as of 2020, what they note in their report is that at least 7 million people were internally displaced by disasters in 104 countries. Now, this is a really low number, partly because they've only started collecting this data in the last couple of years. So we know that the numbers in reality are much higher. But at the same time, displacements happen because of climate-induced factors, but also because of conflict and violence, which the underlying causes of which are multiple, including environmental change, but also other reasons, as we know. And here we saw a record of 48 million people living in internal displacement, and this is just within the countries, as a result of conflict and violence in almost 59 countries. And we know that also, if you can see the maps to the right, the top being the displacements for disasters and the bottom from conflict and violence, the nature and scale of this issue varies across the regions, across the world. But you can also see that sub-Saharan Africa is oftentimes the worst affected. And when you take a slightly deeper look at it, what we find is that the increasing displacements due to weather and climate-related events in recent years, as compared to conflicts, is varying. It differs in different countries. In DRC, you can see that much of the movement is due to conflict and violence. In the case of Somalia, it's obviously driven by droughts and environmental degradation. And on the right, you can see how these numbers are beginning to ramp up, and that is a matter of concern. And so what the World Bank was looking at this issue, and we've already understood how critical climate is, and that development and climate are integrally linked. And at the same time, noting the increased numbers of displacement, we really wanted to understand the issue. There were numbers out there citing 25 billion up to 1 billion people who could be on the move. What were the numbers? They were oftentimes very much a back of the envelope calculations or guesstimates. But we wanted to take a closer look at this issue so that we can be better prepared to respond in a more effective way. And we decided to focus on what we call internal climate migration. Why internal, you may ask? Because actually 70% of the people who move within their countries. This is the UN data. And even when they move across, they move within the regions. But we decided that it was important to focus at the source of where this was happening, so within the countries. The second thing that we did was we focused on what we call the slow onset climate change. We know that people are displaced, in the face of a hurricane or a flood, and sometimes they do tend to return, and most of the time they do. But the slow, persistent onset climate change that is sort of amplifying, it was something that we thought was important to understand, especially in the face of climate change that is already unfolding. And we looked at a time duration between now and 2050 so that decision makers and planners and communities like yourself can begin to look across the horizon and begin to plan things more effectively. So the objective was really to help policymakers better plan and prepare, and not just in terms of the scale of issues, but really what were those areas, those potential hotspots where we could come in with early action and to support the constructive dialogue in a way so that we can inform action and policy. So what we did was we applied a scientific approach using the best state-of-the-art global data sets. And this is the climate data sets from the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, the development data sets, and the climate impacts. But to understand the issue, we set up a sort of a scenario-based approach. And we started with what we call the pessimistic scenario. This is the scenario which really says that if we don't do anything about climate change and we continue to our emissions as we are, then we will be obviously following a certain global warming. And if you couple that with unequal development, which is really development that is not inclusive and which is oftentimes what we see in many of the developing countries, what would that really mean? I might add here that our focus was on the developing world. Then you have a certain outcome. But on the other hand, we compared it to two scenarios, one which is more inclusive, where we say that high emissions continue, but you have better development pathways. And the other alternative was where we pursue the climate-friendly policies. We've all heard about the Paris Agreement, trying to keep warming below 2 degrees and preferably below 1.5. And that's what would happen then because it reduces the emissions and if we combine that with unequal development. Very quickly, we brought together the state-of-the-art of climate data with demographic data because we know populations will continue to increase, and we brought the climate impact data. We modeled it at what we call a 14-kilometer grid cell. And then we estimate the spatial shifts of population that would happen as a consequence of climate change, deducted from those where there's no climate change considered, which is what normal demographic models do. And then the results were aggregated upwards at the national level and then to the regional level. So what we found for the 3 regions that we studied, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South Asia, across these 3 regions, we could see as many as 143 million people who could be moving as a consequence of the slow onset climate change within their countries under the pessimistic scenario. That's the high end. But what we also found is that the numbers would decrease with the other 2 scenarios, which means a good inclusive development as well as good climate action could reduce the numbers, and in some cases as much as 80%. This 143 number often confuses people. What does it really mean? First of all of these are human phases. And secondly, if you think about it as the population combined of Germany and South Africa, where the Reverend is from, that's quite a large number. The second issue is that this number it camouflages the geographic variation. What we found is that the preponderance of this movement would happen in Sub-Saharan Africa, followed by South Asia and Latin America. And that's because of the pre-existing vulnerabilities in Sub-Saharan Africa. I'm mindful that we have a panelist from the island states, and that island states are particularly vulnerable because although the numbers are small, as a percentage of their population, there are huge numbers. I might add here that in the current study that is underway under Groundswell 2, which we will launch in September, we are looking at other regions of the world, East Asia and the island states and Middle East and North Africa. So that's forthcoming. But the important point is that the patterns are very similar, and concrete climate and development action can really help us to reduce the kind of scale of mobility that we might see as a consequence of climate change. So the numbers are big and there's a geographic variation, but now let's look at the trajectory. What we found in all cases was between 2020 and 2050, if the numbers will increase. And that's because we are already locked into a certain amount of warming, sadly, and we want to change those trajectories. But for now, we can see that even the good climate action would actually help us to bring that down, but we are locked into a certain number, but early action is key. And the window of opportunity for early action is rapidly shrinking. And if we do nothing about this, then post 2050, obviously it would get worse. And you can see again here that South Asia, that between this trajectory, there could be as much as a 6-fold increase. And I might add here that that is particularly due to Bangladesh with its high population and immense vulnerability with low-lying areas. So, but beyond the numbers, I think what is really important is what we perceive as the climate in and out migration hotspots. The red areas are areas where people will gravitate to because they're relatively more attractive because of the climate factors. And then the blue areas are where people would move away from. You see two panels here, on the left 2030 and on the right 2050. And you can see the emergence, the spread, and the intensity of this climate in and out migration hotspots will increase over time. So how we sort of want to avert and minimize this provides us a far-sighted action on increasing the resilience of people, of assets, and of infrastructure. A quick snapshot into Bangladesh, I mean, a zoom in, and you can see in the case of Bangladesh, how the coastal areas would be affected and people would move towards the northeast and the rain-fed areas. But the thing that is important in Bangladesh is when we compare the climate migrants with other migrants who are migrating for social, economic, education, and other reasons, the pace of migrants, climate migrants, would outnumber those of other types of migrants. And this, I think, is another important reason why we need to address the vulnerabilities from climate change. In the case of Ethiopia, I think what is interesting is that climate patterns in the Horn of Africa are very uncertain, and this is something that we also have to keep in mind. And they, in fact, project better water conditions under high emission scenario, and therefore give us lower numbers. But the white areas really reflect the band of uncertainties, but still we do have the pattern that is consistent. What we find is that the red basket and the rain-fed highlands, which have been really critical, which is the green area and the livelihood zones, become areas of out-migration. Now, this is really concerning because you're talking about areas that is highly populous country that has 100 million people today, and by 2050 could have a high end of 180 million people with a huge youth bulge, many of which are engaged in agriculture. So how do we sort of see this dampening of population in the rain-fed areas? How do we look at alternatives in terms of livelihoods, and how do we strengthen their resilience? I think these are activities that communities can be really engaged in alongside with good policy action. And each of these really is a human face behind the story. And, we were able to track some of the people who were displaced in the recent past. And I think what we hear is some good ways in which we can look at the issue proactively. So the conclusion of the report is that the window of opportunity, we know it's rapidly closing. As early as 2030, we could see a new climate normal, but certainly by 2040 and 2052, depending on the scale of emissions. So we are baked into a certain amount of climate migration, but what we also hope is that it doesn't have to be a crisis, but we need to do a few things right now. We need to certainly cut down our greenhouse gases and reduce the climate pressure on people's livelihoods and the associated scale. But then we also need to act and put that lens of climate migration into development planning. We need to look at what is it that we can do before people are forced or pushed out and have to move. And oftentimes there are things that they can do in the communities and in the geographic areas they are in, because they can have better means to adapt to the droughts, adapt to the floods, but make sure that the right policies and right support is there in terms of the infrastructure, in terms of basic services provision, in terms of livelihood options. But there will be cases where people have to move, and the coastal areas are, of course, the easiest to envisage with the sea level rise. and the storm surge. I might add that in our model, we looked at drops in crop productivity, water stress, and sea level compounded by storm surge. So when you come to those areas, how can you make sure you have a managed retreat that's inclusive and preserve the dignity of the people who have to move? And then once people do move, there is also the social cohesion that is needed between the sending and the receiving areas. But last of all, I think this is an area that is, we need to understand better. We need to understand it from the top down and the bottom up. And I think more inclusive ways of understanding and unpacking these narratives to inform policy and inform action at the community level is critical. So let me stop there and thank you very much. I had to go really fast, but I'm sure you got the story.
Dr. Rigaud, we are deeply grateful for this work and for your work in general. Before you leave, I would like to just ask you two very quick questions. One was something asked by one of our viewers, and it was a question: was the projected scale that you were showing disaggregated by gender, by sex, male, female?
Very good question. In this first version of work that we did not do a gender disaggregation, but we've been doing some deeper dives in Lake Victoria Basin and in the West Africa region, where we did look at the median age and the gender issues. The gender issues did not emerge as a particularly strong coefficient, but the age factor did.
The age factor did more than gender.
And then we also, in this latest work, brought in a layer or a mask on conflict. And you can imagine that the coefficient is weak right now, but has a potential to be higher, where people would tend to move away from conflict areas. And so that is also a matter of concern and interest, how we sort of be proactive on those fronts.
Okay, thank you for that. I know you have to leave. Will we be able to share your incredible PowerPoint with everyone following this? Is that possible?
Yes, it is. I did send it to Rebecca. Actually.
Excellent. And the same will be asked of Dr. Mash about hers that she'll be sharing. That's wonderful. We're deeply grateful for the work you do. As one more note to all of our viewers, do note that as an agent of change trying to work on some of these issues, the Episcopal Migration Ministries here in this country continues to work alongside refugee resettlement agencies throughout to try to help on the reactive or response to these issues. But what you have shown us is an incredibly important picture that I hope we can make use of, learn from, and hopefully make a difference with. Thank you so much, Dr. Rigaud, and we wish you well for the rest of your day or evening.
Thank you very much. I'm really sorry to miss the discussion. I'm sure it's going to be interesting, but I also want to appreciate the frontline work that your services do and your community. They are really important as the first line of defense against these growing issues of importance. So thank you very much to all of you and happy conversation.
Thank you for your good work. We were delighted to have had Dr. Rigaud with us. If some of you are wondering, yes, the volume was going in and out on her end, but I hope and expect that all of you were able to hear her just fine when it came to the actual presentation. Now we turn again to the Reverend Canon Dr. Rachel Mash. Dr. Mash, really grateful for you to be with us and want to take a look at what climate change and climate migration means for Anglicans in Southern Africa. What's the role of local churches and the international communion in addressing the causes and impacts?
Thank you very much, and it's wonderful to be with you this afternoon. And is my screen coming up nice and clearly?
It is indeed. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, so as Canon Chuck said, I'm from Southern Africa, which is 6 countries: South Africa, Swatini, Lesotho, Namibia, Angola, and Mozambique. And I'm going to share a bit about what it means for our region and some ways in which Anglicans can get involved. So there's 3 types of migration that I'm seeing happening now. There's obviously the first is the disaster migration, caused predominantly by drought and by extreme weather events. So in Namibia, about 3 years ago, they had a very bad drought. In northern Namibia, most people don't have a bank account. So their cattle are their savings for the future. So your herd of cattle is the way that you plan to educate your children in the future, get your daughter married off, and plan for your retirement. So the government told the people that they needed to slaughter their cattle. There was no funds available for feeding the cattle. And we got stories coming back that some of the elderly people, the elderly men in particular, had tried to commit suicide when they were told they had to slaughter their entire cattle. And after that, many of the young people just left because there was nothing for them. So they went either to the big city, Windhoek, or they tried to look for jobs in South Africa. In Mozambique on the east side, they've been hit by wave after wave of extreme weather events. You've probably heard of Cyclone Idai, which destroyed 90% of the city of Beira here pictured and caused devastation to 3 million people. The city of Beira will go down in history as the first major city to be completely devastated by climate change, and there were several reasons for this. First of all, climate change increased the intensity of the rainfall, and so Cyclone Idai produced nearly a year's worth of rain in just a few days. The severe drought over the last few years had hardened the soil, which increased the runoff of floodwaters. And then over the last century since Beira was founded, the ocean has risen by 30 centimeters, so it's now sitting below sea level. Added to that, huge levels of commercial deforestation allowed the floods to rush through denuded soils. And so, as well as destroying houses and infrastructure, a huge inland sea was created. And I spoke to one of the relief organizations that was delivering water purification tablets for us, and he said that the helicopter pilots had become really distressed because they'd set out trying to find villages and actually couldn't find the villages that they were looking for. Now, it took weeks and weeks for this inland sea to drain down, and it left complete devastation. The fields were full of salt, and the harvests were, of course, destroyed, and people's homes had been completely washed away, and some of those villages never went back. The other type of migration is slow migration. One would look at some of the places that people end up living in South Africa, coming from these other countries. This is a typical squatter community at the poorest end of the poor. What would take somebody away from a rural area where they can grow their own food and they end up living in one of these communities? I find this map quite shocking from UNEP because it shows the projected changes in agricultural productivity by 2080. Now in Southern Africa, you can see it's red, which means that we're looking at a 50% reduction in food production. So a smallholder farmer who is just making it, just feeding their family, can no longer feed their family, and they are pushed off the land. I want to tell you a story of a village, and they call it the place of the sacks, place of Ingro. About 15 years ago, there were great quantities of maize and sorghum and vegetables, and the soil was fertile. And the rains were so reliable and predictable that they all set October the 15th every year as the day to plant their seeds. And they knew the rain would come a few days later. The river was full of fish. The village was so productive that it was called Sack Place because of the so many sacks that they produced, and they could plant crops twice a year. 20 years ago, the only serious drought people could remember was way back in 1949. Since then, there have been 5. In Sack Place, the river has dried up. There's no more fish. Crop yields have collapsed as a result of flooding, droughts, and extreme temperatures. This year, they harvested no maize at all. And vegetables, no chance. Water wells have dried up, and now you have to dig very deep. And what about the indirect effects? People are afraid because they can see the signs that climate is getting less predictable and hotter. Fewer children are in schools because of malnutrition and the need to work. Many people are leaving the land to the big cities, and there's nothing for them either. And many young people drift into crime out of desperation. The third type of migration that we are seeing, and this is caused by the activities of fossil fuel companies. So these companies are causing climate change, and they are also causing migration. What are they actually doing? First of all, they evict people from the land, mostly rural communities who do not have paperwork to say, I own this property. And then they are destabilizing communities. We're dealing currently with a situation in northern Mozambique, where because local people were pushed off their land, they were told to move 10 kilometers from the coast so they can no longer fish. and vast amount of development going in by Total for this gas that they have discovered, but the local people were not benefiting at all. So the young men then joined Al-Shabaab, started attacking the government workers and the oil workers, and then they upped the ante on their violence, and they started beheading children. So people have fled from there, 900,000 people internally displaced because of that migration. What is the impact of migration? South Africa is a very xenophobic country, sadly to say. And when people come from other countries there, they're often treated really badly. There are a few practical things. For instance, if you don't have an ID, if you are an economic migrant as opposed to a refugee, you can't get an ID. So they don't have a bank account, so they're wide open to crime. When the government gave out COVID relief, there was no COVID relief given for foreign nationals. People don't go to South Africa for the South Africa dream. They go there to escape the nightmare of where they are living currently. What is the role of the church? So first of all, disaster. There's this fantastic, I would say this is a brilliant book, the Pastors and Disasters training course is brilliant. And here's a group of people in Mozambique doing the Pastors and Disasters just after Cyclone Idai. And then there's adaptation. How do we keep the people where they live and adapting to climate change? So in Mozambique, his Bishop Carlos is helping people to make their own bricks so that they can build their homes more strongly. They're also planting cashew trees. Why cashew trees? Because cashews is a cash crop, so people won't cut them down for firewood. In Namibia, people are putting in water tanks, and they're also being trained to do climate smart agriculture, which takes much less water for irrigation. And then there's the support for disaster refugees. The picture at the bottom is the distribution of the water purification tablets. Churches are ideally placed to get things out into the community. And this is a group of people that were trained in WASH, water and sanitation, to help people after the floods to deal with some of the waterborne diseases. Then there's the integration of refugees into communities. When people come from other countries to South Africa, the best way for them to get integrated in is through faith communities. If they join a church or a mosque, it's much easier for them to integrate. Biggest challenge is the language, what people are singing in or worshiping in. I want to share you a story of this community of Nomzamo. One of the nurses said that they'd had a high number of deaths of very young babies. And when they looked into it, they realized that it was the Malawian mums. They had come to South Africa, and as they were breastfeeding their babies and the babies would cry, they thought they were hungry. So they would feed them soft porridge before they were old enough. The babies would choke and they would die from choking from the soft porridge. These young mums were on their own. They had no grannies and they hadn't been integrated into the community. So the mums of the community were not helping them to raise their kids. So issues of social cohesion. And then I think what the church also needs to do is we need to get our money out of fossil fuels. The fossil fuel companies are the ones causing the violence, causing the migration, as well as causing climate change. So we can stop climate change and the displacement of rural people by fossil fuel companies and try and limit the internal destabilization. This is another issue we're dealing with currently in Namibia of a Canadian company which is wanting to start in the Kavango, again pushing people off the land in northern Namibia. So I'd like to just end with a message from Bishop Ernesto, who is in northern Namibia, currently coping with so many crises, cyclones, climate change, internally displaced people. He says, fossil fuel investments increase climate change and impacts on the most vulnerable and also destabilize communities. We plead with the international community, take your money out of fossil fuels, invest in renewable energy, which is decentralized, benefits local people, and does not contribute to climate change. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for this tremendous presentation, Ken, Rachel, very much so. And again, I invite folks to put your questions in the Q&A section. We'll get to those later. But I'm deeply grateful to see in the chat section right now OGR Director Rebecca Blotchley shared a creation care series that Rebecca Cotton has produced that is absolutely excellent. And that Pastors and Disasters Toolkit that Dr. Mash just talked about and showed us a slide of, Mandy Marshall put that on in the chat room as well. So please, I hope you all are looking in the chat room to get some of these wonderful resources. And Dr. Mash, we'll look forward to coming back to you in the Q&A time. Thank you so much for that. With that, I want to turn to our final panelists. Again, Dr. Abraham Hauriasi is General Secretary of the Anglican Church of Melanesia, and we are eager to hear from you, specifically looking at what climate change and climate migration means for Anglicans in the Solomon Islands and the South Pacific. And again, what's the role of local churches and the international Anglican community in addressing the causes and impacts there? Dr. Hauriasi.
Thank you, Chuck, and good morning to you, to everybody. And thank you for the opportunity to share what climate change means to Anglicans in the Solomon Islands and also throughout the people of the South Pacific. I think it's important on the outset, before I go on to discuss the actual impact of climate change and climate migration. I think it's important to understand that Solomon Islands, like most other countries in the South Pacific, are island nations. They're made up of hundreds of small, very small islands, and many of which are coral atolls, and with many of them just only a few meters above sea level. So one can see that any rise in the sea level can be quite disastrous to these very low islands in the South Pacific. In the Solomon Islands, in particular, a lot of these small low-lying islands that are threatened by climate change and in particular rise in sea levels are members of the Anglican Church. So the church has quite a big responsibility to see how we can assist these people who are threatened by sea level rise. Also, it's also important noting that in Solomon Islands in particular, the presence of the national government or any form of government is very weak in the rural communities, in rural communities. And so the church is the only institution that is present and is present with the rural communities. So you can see that the role of the church is quite important. So what does climate change look like in the Solomons and in the South Pacific region? As we have heard from Dr. Rachel's presentation, it's sea level rise is quite a serious issue with many of the islands in the South Pacific. With the sea level rise, we have problems with erosion of human settlements. We know people in the South Pacific, a lot of them, they tend to live in the coastal areas along the coast. So any rise in the sea level tends to affect the human settlements. And so we have people having to move inland just to escape from this sea level rising. So we also have any examples of settlements being flooded by king tides. So that is I mean, forces people to move inland from the coast. And a lot of those people, they find it difficult because they depend on the sea for their livelihoods, and moving inland causes also problems with food security for them. And I said food security issues as a result of sea level rise. Many of these islands, they don't have rivers or streams, and they depend entirely on wells. And with the sea level rise, we have contamination of wells, and so food security becomes a problem for them. And with sea level rise, we also have problems with food production, and so a lot of these islands, they now, because of the low production of food, they're now having to depend on manufactured goods, where they can buy from the shops. But then there's also a problem for them, is that because of their remoteness from the larger centers, there is irregular shipping transport to the islands. And so we also find examples of people hunger because of irregular transport to the islands. So they depend entirely on, they depend a lot on manufactured goods from the shops. And this also leads to other health issues. People, they depend on manufactured goods, and it also leads to other health issues like non-communicable diseases. That is becoming a huge problem in the South Pacific when people depend on manufactured food or processed foods, because their gardens are no longer producing enough crops in some of these islands. Also, we also have problems with economic security because of climate change and sea level rise. And a lot of these low-lying islands, they depend on coconuts as one of their main cash crops. And with the sea level rise, the coconut plantations are not producing as much as they should. And so there's also a problem with economic security. And also with sea level rise, there are people who live in many of these artificial islands, these man-made islands. And a couple of these islands have actually disappeared because of sea level rise. And people are having to move to nearby bigger islands. So we have examples of several of these artificial islands that have actually completely disappeared because of sea level rise. We also have examples of more frequent cyclones. They are also increasing in intensity. Just our cyclone season runs from November to around April every year. And just in the last season, we have at least 3 cyclones of category 4 or 5, which is quite strong. So we are having very regular cyclones every year. And because of from the cyclones, we have destruction of homes, people becoming displaced, and also damage to crops, which also leads to hunger. So these people will also have to be supported. And changing weather patterns also results in more heavy rains, and again resulting in low crop yields, which also leads on to hunger and problems with food security in a lot of these communities. And so what has the church been doing, or what is the church currently doing to try and address some of the issues arising directly from climate change? The church, the Anglican Church of Melanesia, together with our regional and international Anglican agencies, have been involved in several ways, trying to address some of these issues. We have been doing a lot of work around training and awareness on disaster preparedness and responses. We have set up disaster committees in all our dioceses, and we have also been using this pastors and disasters. The manual that Canon Rachel had just shown a few moments ago. We've been doing a lot of training on how the clergy, they can do initial assessments after any natural disasters or cyclones. In terms of food security, we have been providing water tanks to some of our communities that are experiencing problems with water. Also, we've been introducing farming methods in areas of high density, especially in urban areas. We've been also distributing seedlings of crops that are resilient in areas where of poor soil quality, especially those that have been experiencing soil salinity and where crops cannot grow properly. So we also been involved in projects to provide seedlings. We've also run workshops for communities that are seriously under threat from climate change, especially those who will be requiring relocation in the nearby future. So we've run workshops for them just to introduce them of what relocation might mean for them, and how they can prepare for the eventual relocation in the future. So we've been preparing them towards that process. The church has also established climate change observatories. You know, in the Solomons, we've talked about climate change and what it is, but we don't have the data to support what is happening physically on the ground. So we have set up climate change observatories in 4 sites around the country, and this observatory they will measure the sea level rise, especially the changes in the shoreline, the rise in the sea level on the coastal areas, and also rainfall and temperatures. So we set up those observatories to provide collect data to show the government and other agencies that this is what is happening in the country. We've also been training and mobilizing church volunteers in disaster and management activity, disaster risk management activities. One of the things that we've also been doing with some of our partners is to identify church facilities throughout the islands. Those facilities that we can use in times of disaster. So we've been doing mapping of all these church facilities that we can use in the event of any disasters. And finally, we've also been involved a lot in relief, providing relief, immediate relief in the event of disasters, and also helping out with reconstruction work with communities that are affected by natural disasters. So I think in terms of relocation, I think one of the challenges we face is that some of these communities, and it's generally within many of the South Pacific countries, people, they identify very, very closely with the land or with the islands. And so there is some general reluctance for people to move, to relocate from the islands, despite the threats from climate change. So we have to really work very closely with them to explain things that eventually people may have to move, although there is a general reluctance by people to move from the islands. So I think that's one of the things that the church has to really work with those communities to see, try to convince them that at some point in the future they have to move from the islands. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hauriasi. Much appreciated. And yes, to hear the conditions and the struggles, and you're right, and the difficulties in saying you need to move. That's a very real difficulty. I wanted to call everyone's attention, those who are viewing. Please note the note that was put forward, that the links that were shared in the chat room, as well as the PowerPoint presentations and the recording of this entire webinar, all of this will be sent to you in a follow-up email for all those who registered for this webinar. And so if you've seen some of the wonderful links that have been put in to the chat room, you will have access to those as well as to the PowerPoints and to this overall webinar. My thanks to Alan Yarborough on helping make that happen. So we've heard quite a bit. This is sobering things that we are hearing. So many people, especially in the West and in the global North, are saying, okay, we're getting through the pandemic. Let's get life to some kind of normal, not realizing that what is normal globally is not all very good, and that there's so much need that is still there. I couldn't help but think, Dr. Mash, as you were talking at the end about the bishops of Namibia and Angola, I couldn't help but think about working with them just a couple of years ago at a Chatham House event, and also over here in the States on issues dealing with malaria and how to address that. These things are all interconnected. And so, in fact, I would like to ask you all the question, how are the needs of climate migrants different from those of other migrants for all kinds of other reasons, violence, illness, etc.? What is it that you see as being are there any needs that are unique to climate migrants that we could be aware of?
I think the one thing that I have picked up on is that sense of I can't go home. If you're going, because say you're Zimbabwean and you leave Zimbabwe because of the current political crisis, which is you always want to go home. So they would always say, well, we'll go home when there's a different president. We'll go home when that's been sorted out. With climate migration, to actually have to leave because you can no longer live on your land is the most distressing thing, and you don't see that it can ever get better. How can my land ever? How can my family be raised on that land again? So I think that's one of the key differences. It's a very, very depressing thing that I don't think I can go back there. I can't live there again.
Indeed, and it's interesting how controversial it is to refer to those who are migrating because of climate issues, to refer to them as refugees. Many oppose that term, and in fact, if I remember right, Oxfam actually opposes the use of the term refugees in speaking about climate migrants. It really is a different category. Anything you would like to add to that, Dr. Hauriasi?
Now, I think I agree with Canon Rachel. I think one of the biggest challenge for climate change migrants is being able to to call a place home, because I mean their island or their village is also their identity or their culture, and they should be able to practice their culture or their language wherever they go. And I think that's one of the maybe the fears that they have. I mean, they can't integrate with their new location, but they should also be free to practice their culture freely and their language. And I mean, the fear is they might lose all of those in the new location. So
each of you has addressed a bit the role of local churches as well as the international Anglican community. But again, this is being sponsored, this particular webinar is being sponsored by the Episcopal Church's Office of Government Relations. Could we say a little something about what governments can do and perhaps what we can do who want to advocate with our various governments? Because we have people attending this webinar from all over the world, all under different governments. What can be done by governments? What can we do to prod governments in this regard?
I think what we can do to prod our governments, and what we can also do, I mean, as I mentioned, I see the primary cause, obviously, of climate change is the fossil fuel companies. So we need to actually shift as fast as possible from fossil fuels to renewables. But one of the problems and one of the sort of myths, I think, is that people say we can continue to invest in fossil fuel companies because they are moving. And the way that they are reducing their carbon emissions is in shifting from oil to gas. And they are now finding new gas explorations in Africa and no doubt across the world. So we can't keep with those same fossil fuel companies. We actually need to pull right out of those fossil fuel companies, whether it's our government money, whether it is our church money, whether it is our business, our university, whatever. So to pull out of them and to invest as fast as possible in renewable energies. Renewable energy is decentralized and it creates local jobs for people. And if people are no longer able to be in the agricultural sector because of climate change, then renewable energy can create other jobs, and it can be local jobs that people can be making, hot water geysers or solar panels or whatever. So to get those jobs in small little factories producing those items for renewable energy in the areas which have been impacted by climate change, so that people can at least stay in those communities, not have to go to the big cities or to a different country.
Thank you for that. Dr. Hauriasi, you'd like to add to that?
Yes, I think one of the other things that maybe the government can work with the churches together with is to try and identify locations where these climate migrants can go. Like in the Solomon Islands and with many of the South Pacific countries, land is owned by tribes and communities. So I think it's important for the government to take some lead with the churches to negotiate with tribal landowners or customary landowners so that they can start negotiating on possible locations for these migrants or climate change migrants to move into this. It's not easy. Some of them they just don't want to move to just any area. They prefer to go to certain areas that they are comfortable with, and I think one of their preferences will be to move to areas where there is a similar church denomination there, so that they can easily move in and settle with familiar surrounding. So I think that's one of the things that our governments can do, work with churches to identify those locations.
I know that the Episcopal Church and many other parts of the communion are a part of actions such as COP26 coming up and other ways of trying to speak out to the various governments of the world. I'm also grateful for the work of the various think tanks. I mentioned Chatham House earlier, also the Council on Foreign Relations, of which I'm a member, but also Brookings. I know that all of these have been also finding ways to speak out. I would encourage anyone who is watching here to find a way that your church, your Anglican province, but also to find as much information as you can through these other sources so as to help us be able to advocate even more effectively with our various governments. Any last words? If you want to have one last thing you want to get out there, Ken and Rachel, would love for you to kind of have a last word before I close this out here.
I think one of the misconceptions that we have, certainly in South Africa, as as the xenophobic country that we are, and maybe it's true around other parts, is that migrants come to take our jobs, and migrants come to bring problems. And actually, I think we also need to remember that the type of people who have the incredible bravery of leaving their place where they live to seek a better life, those are the entrepreneurs. Those are the people who have really got a very special spark. And if we can embrace them and integrate them into our societies, they will bring so many gifts and so many job creation possibilities and so much fresh life to our societies. So I think we mustn't always talk about migrants as a problem. We must also talk about them in terms of the blessing that they bring to the communities where they choose to live. And to open our doors and to embrace them.
Which itself can be an educational challenge for us to do with our own, with folks already here. Absolutely. Abraham, good to have you back. I saw we lost you for a moment. Good to have you back. Any last words you would like to share with us? Any last words of wisdom?
I think it is important that it's not too late for us to do something to prevent further problems for those who are already threatened by this climate change impact. I think it's important we can all work together, and I think our respective governments can play a leading role in trying to take certain measures so we can reduce the impact of climate change. I think that's very important. Churches working with the government. I think it's important for governments to come on board with the churches, the work the churches are doing.
And we can work on that. It is not too late, although it is too late for us to continue with this particular webinar. We are at the end. I am deeply grateful to Dr. Rigaud, who had to leave us earlier, to you, Reverend Canon Dr. Rachel Mash, to you, Dr. Abraham Hauriasi, for your ongoing work and for that of your colleagues as well. I also want to thank the Anglican Communion Working Group on Migration, as well as agents of change around us, such as the Anglican Alliance, Episcopal Relief and Development, Episcopal Migration Ministries, and others who have been able to contribute links on the chat room, which again we will make available to you. I'm truly grateful to our Episcopal Church's Office of Government Relations, led by Rebecca Blotchley, and particularly want to give a shout out to Rebecca Cotton, our OGR fellow, who's been leading the environmental work for the office. She wrote that wonderful Creation Care Climate series, which is in the chat room, a truly valuable resource. Also, my thanks to you, Alan Yarborough, for your fantastic, as always, behind the scenes tech support to us in this. And of course, my thanks to all of you who have taken the time to attend this webinar and for your care about this critical issue. May God indeed strengthen all of us to be agents of change and to help address these critical issues on this island that we call planet Earth. Thank you. God bless you. Have a great rest of the day or evening to all of you.
Thank you.